You buy a case of vodka for maybe $40 a bottle, pour it into overpriced cocktails and bottle service setups, and walk away with thousands of dollars a night. That's the version of nightclub ownership that lives in most people's heads. Rich guy, velvet rope, baseline, printing money. It's not entirely wrong. The markup on alcohol really is enormous. But if the math were that simple, nightclubs would be one of the safest businesses in the world to own. They're not. They're one of the most volatile. Industry data consistently shows bars and nightclubs closing at a higher rate than restaurants that serve food, which is itself a business known for thin margins and short lifespans. So the question worth asking isn't how much money can a nightclub make, it's why does an industry with some of the best margins in retail also have one of the worst survival rates? The answer has almost nothing to do with the price of vodka.
Start with what a nightclub is actually selling, because it's not what's on the receipt. A customer thinks he's paying for a drink and a cover charge. What he's actually paying for is entry into a room that has been engineered to feel exclusive, desirable, and slightly out of reach. The drink is just the mechanism that lets the club charge him repeatedly over the course of the night without making him feel like he's paying an entry fee every 20 minutes. This distinction matters because it explains almost every strange decision a club makes. Who gets in for free, who waits in line, why the cover charge seems to apply only to some people. If you think the product is alcohol, none of that makes sense. If you understand the product is the feeling of being somewhere desirable, all of it does.
Now, the part that actually looks like easy money, the markup. Industry pricing guides consistently point to the same range. Bars typically aim for a pour cost of somewhere between 15 and 25%, meaning the raw alcohol in a drink costs a fraction of what it sells for. A well vodka soda that costs the bar under $1 in raw product can retail for $8 to $12. Spirits in general get marked up 4 to 5 times their wholesale cost. That's not a rounding error. That's the core economic engine of the entire hospitality industry. And it's the reason bars can survive on a smaller footprint than restaurants, which have to deal with food spoilage, kitchen labor, and much tighter margins on plates.
But here's where the popular version of the story falls apart. That beautiful markup is a gross margin, not a profit. Before that 80% gross margin turns into actual money in an owner's pocket, it has to survive rent in a prime location, a liquor license that might have cost more than the building, sound and lighting systems that can run into 6 figures, insurance premiums inflated by the liability of serving alcohol to large crowds, security staff every single operating night, and a payroll that includes bartenders, door staff, promoters, and often a small army of contractors who only show up on the 2 or 3 nights a week the club actually makes money. A neighborhood bar can be profitable running 5 or 6 nights a week at a modest pace. A nightclub usually has one shot, Friday and Saturday, sometimes a bonus weeknight, to generate almost all of its weekly revenue. If those nights underperform, there is no slow and steady Tuesday lunch crowd to make up the difference. The margin is enormous. The window to capture it is tiny.
This is where an overlooked mechanism starts to matter more than the alcohol itself: the crowd. Anyone who has walked past a nightclub with a line outside and a nearly empty one next door assumes the busy club is simply more popular. What's actually happening is closer to stagecraft. Clubs and the promoters who work with them spend real money and real effort making a room look full and desirable before it has a single paying customer inside. Promoters build guest lists of people who get in for free, specifically because a packed, energetic room convinces the people who do pay that the cover charge and drink prices are worth it. Some venues have gone further, paying groups of attractive women an hourly rate just to occupy the room early in the night, creating the appearance of a party before one has actually started. None of this is philanthropy. It's inventory management for atmosphere. The room's energy is a manufactured input, not a natural byproduct of success.
That leads to a genuinely counterintuitive fact about how nightclubs make their money. The guy paying $800 for a bottle of vodka that costs the club maybe $40 is not, economically speaking, the most important person in the building. He's the payoff. The free guest list, the paid-to-be-there women, the doorman turning away anyone who doesn't fit the vibe, all of that exists to manufacture the environment that makes the paying customer feel like he's buying access to something scarce, not just a drink.
The paying customer is real revenue, but he is downstream of a much larger, mostly invisible system of curated scarcity. Take away the promoters and the curated crowd, and the same room, the same drinks, and the same music will not generate anywhere near the same revenue, because what's actually being sold, status, desirability, the feeling of being let into somewhere exclusive, has quietly disappeared. There's a second asset hiding in plain sight that most people never think about when they picture nightclub ownership, and in some cities it's worth more than the building the club sits in. It's the liquor license. In states that don't restrict the number of licenses issued, a full liquor license might cost a few $1,000s from the local government, but in states that cap licenses by population, California, New Jersey, and a handful of others, new licenses effectively stop being issued once a region hits its quota. After that, the only way to get one is to buy an existing license on a secondary market, where prices in a market like California can run anywhere from roughly $12,000 to well over $300,000 depending on the county. That's not a permit, that's a scarce, transferable asset with its own price history, its own market, and its own resale value, closer to a taxi medallion than a business license. Some operators have made more money buying, holding, and eventually selling a liquor license than they ever made running the club attached to it. The bar itself can lose money for years, and the owner can still walk away wealthy, simply because the license appreciated. That fact should already be reshaping how you think about the whole industry. A nightclub isn't purely a hospitality business. In license-restricted markets, it's partly a real estate and permit speculation business, wearing a hospitality business as a costume. And that split creates a strange incentive. An owner who understands this has less pressure to make the club itself profitable every single night, because the underlying license and lease might be appreciating regardless of how the dance floor performs. An owner who doesn't understand this is running blind, chasing nightly revenue numbers while ignoring the asset that might actually determine whether the venture succeeds or fails on paper.
Now, for the trade-off nobody puts in the pitch deck. Nightclubs are one of the most cash-intensive businesses that still exists at real scale, and cash-heavy businesses have a specific, predictable failure mode. When a huge share of nightly revenue arrives as physical cash, cover charges, some drink sales, tips changing hands constantly, the temptation to underreport that income is enormous because the incentive is immediate and the enforcement is delayed. Underreport a fraction of the cash coming through the door, and the club's effective profit margin jumps overnight without changing a single price on the menu. It looks, for a while, like a shortcut to the very profitability that legitimate pricing and volume struggle to produce. But it isn't a shortcut. It's a loan against the future, taken out from regulators and tax authorities who eventually notice a business generating enormous cash volume while reporting income that doesn't match its visible success.
That temptation sets off a chain reaction that has ended more than one legendary nightclub. Underreporting cash requires keeping the real numbers somewhere, in a second set of books, in cash physically hidden on premises, in a habit of paying staff and suppliers off the books. Every one of those workarounds leaves a trail, and success makes owners careless about that trail, because a nightclub that's making real money and getting real attention starts attracting exactly the kind of scrutiny that a quiet, cash-skimming operation cannot survive. The more visible and celebrated the club becomes, the more dangerous its own success is to the scheme hiding underneath it. That's the mechanism worth watching for in the story that follows, because it plays out almost exactly this way in the most famous nightclub collapse in American history. Studio 54 opened on April 26, 1977, in a former opera house and television studio on West 54th Street in Manhattan, built by two college friends from Syracuse, Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager, who had already failed at an earlier restaurant venture. What they built next became almost instantly the most famous nightclub on Earth, a room that mixed movie stars, musicians, artists, and members of the public willing to fight through a ruthlessly curated door policy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with looking like you belonged in the room. It worked. In its first year alone, the club reportedly pulled in around $7 million, a figure worth roughly 4 times that in today's money. Rubel, never known for restraint, told a reporter that only organized crime made more money than his nightclub did. That line would later be remembered as one of the more expensive boasts in American nightlife history.
Behind the velvet rope, the club was already running into the exact structural problem this video has been building toward. Cash was pouring in nightly in volumes that were difficult to track and, according to later court findings, were being deliberately underreported. Investigators and reporting at the time described a pattern of skimming somewhere between 40 and 60% of the club's real receipts to avoid paying the taxes owed on them. For a while, that skimming simply made an already lucrative club look even more lucrative on the balance sheet the owners actually cared about, their own. The warning signs were there early. The club had also run into trouble over its liquor licensing shortly after opening, forced at times to rely on daily licenses rather than a permanent one. None of it slowed the party down. The turning point came on December 14, 1978, when federal agents raided Studio 54. What they found matched the pattern this video described a few minutes ago almost exactly. Cash stashed inside the building, records that documented systematic underreporting, and a paper trail that made the skimming impossible to argue away. 6 months later, Rubel and Schrager were formally charged with conspiring to evade roughly $2.5 million in corporate income taxes. They ultimately pleaded guilty to tax evasion in exchange for the government dropping additional charges. And in January 1980, a federal judge sentenced both men to 3.5 years in prison, telling them their crime reflected, in his words, tremendous arrogance. They served about 13 months before their sentences were reduced. The accelerating consequences after that are almost a case study of their own in what happens when the person is also the license. Schrager sold the club from behind bars. It reopened under new ownership in 1981, limped through a few more years without the two men who had defined its identity, and closed permanently as a discotheque in 1986, less than a decade after that legendary opening night. The room itself hadn't changed. The music, the design, even much of the crowd's appetite for exactly that kind of nightlife hadn't gone anywhere. What collapsed was the specific, cash-fueled, under-the-table version of the business that had made the club's early economics look so much better than they legally were. Studio 54 didn't fail because people stopped wanting to go there. It failed because the mechanism that made its early profitability look extraordinary was the same mechanism that eventually destroyed it. That's the domino effect in miniature. A cash-heavy business creates a temptation to hide income. Hiding income requires a paper trail. The trail gets found, and the discovery doesn't just cost money. It costs the entire enterprise, because the people running it were themselves inseparable from the license and reputation that made it valuable. The modern nightlife industry adapted to that lesson, even if most customers never noticed the adaptation. Point-of-sale systems now track nearly every drink sold and every card swiped in real time, which makes old-school cash skimming far harder to pull off at scale than it was in the disco era. Cashless payment has become close to universal at higher-end venues, partly for convenience and partly because a fully digital sales record is much harder to quietly underreport. Ownership itself has shifted too. A growing share of major nightclubs and lounges, especially in cities like Las Vegas and Miami, are now run not by a single owner-operator with a taste for risk, but by hospitality groups that operate multiple venues as a portfolio, spreading the financial exposure of any single room's bad month across a broader, steadier business. The romantic image of the lone nightclub owner living large off cash under the table has largely been replaced by spreadsheets, compliance officers, and centralized accounting. Less glamorous, considerably more survivable. So what does ownership actually look like once you strip away the myth? The best case outcome is real, and it does happen. An owner who treats the liquor license as an appreciating asset, builds a promoter network that manufactures genuine social proof rather than just an empty room dressed up, keeps poor costs disciplined, and treats the 2 or 3 nights a week that matter as the entire business rather than an afterthought, can generate the kind of margins that make headlines. The realistic successful outcome looks less dramatic. Steady profitability in the range most bar operators describe, often somewhere around 10 to 15% net margin after everything is accounted for, built on volume and consistency rather than a single spectacular opening year. The realistic negative outcome is the far more common one. A club that opens strong on hype, burns through its promotional advantage within a year or two as the crowd chases the next new room, and closes once rent, licensing costs, and security payroll outpace a fading Friday night crowd. And the failure scenario, the one this video spent real time on, is the operator who tries to shortcut the entire structural challenge by hiding cash instead of solving the underlying economics. A decision that, as Studio 54 proved at the highest level the industry has ever seen, doesn't just risk the profit, it risks the license, the building, and eventually the person who thought they'd found the loophole. So the fantasy you probably walked in with, cheap vodka, expensive cocktails, easy money, wasn't wrong about the markup. It was wrong about what's actually being priced. A nightclub doesn't sell alcohol at a huge margin so much as it rents out scarcity, status, and a feeling of exclusivity. And alcohol is simply the billing mechanism that lets it charge for that feeling all night long. The businesses that survive are the ones that understand they're managing a license, a crowd, and a perception as carefully as they manage a bar tab. The ones that don't survive almost always fail for the same underlying reason, whether it's 1978 or this year. They mistook a fragile, engineered illusion of easy money for the real thing, and eventually the gap between the two came due.